I think Mary should be out to join us in just a second.
Yeah.
My name is Avery Ash. I'm the executive director of SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, or REMO to its friends. Well, we spent much of yesterday on the supply side of the energy security discussion. REMO focuses on the demand side of the equation and macro trends in transportation. This includes automation, connectivity, electrification, new models of access and ownership, and the use of big data and analytics, and how these can be leveraged more efficiently and effectively to meet travel needs for goods and people. Like many in this room, I have spent most of my career touting the benefits of a 21st century mobility system. Nearly a quarter of the way through the century, and many, both in the public and policymakers, are starting to ask when that 21st century mobility system is actually going to get here, when the impact of all these trends is going to start to be realized. We are extremely lucky today to have two wonderful speakers and two of our REMO commissioners to help us answer this question and discuss the promise of transportation innovation, the blockers that have held back progress, and the action needed to unlock its ultimate potential. Unfortunately, Robbie stole my introduction to our first guest on night one by describing Mary Nichols as the most effective regulator ever. So I'll simply add that over a 50-year career as an environmental lawyer and a regulator, Mary has built an unparalleled reputation for bringing stakeholders together to solve practical problems in the policy arena. We are also very lucky to have her as the co-chair of REMO. Chris Helsel is the Senior Vice President of Global Operations and the Chief Technology Officer for the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Mindful of the inflection point in mobility, Chris and his team operate with duality, working to enhance Goodyear's core tire product while innovating beyond tires to enable this evolution and future of movement. Applying this segregated but synced approach, Chris is responsible for a global network of tire technology, innovation, research, and product development operations focused on creating industry-leading solutions for consumer, commercial, and off-road vehicles, in addition to aviation and racing. Plus, they've got a great blimp. The future of mobility is a very broad topic, so let's jump right in. REMO published a report in January, you can get copies of it out in the salon, which highlighted how progress toward the 21st century mobility has lagged, and the impact promise has fallen short of expectations. I'd like to start by asking each of you, what do you see as the primary limiting factor for the pace of innovation, and what do you see as the most impactful lever that we can pull going forward to help unlock this potential? Mary, should we start with you?
Sure. I'm not going to try to claim to be an expert on technology, having managed to drop the sound equipment on my way into the stage. I apologize for my somewhat tardy arrival this morning, but I do have a long history of having worked in this area and seen how over time fields that we thought were completely different, energy policy, transportation policy, air quality, climate, are converging together. And I think the report sort of lays that out quite nicely. The question is, though, how can we move faster and more effectively towards integrating these fields and coming up with solutions that will be durable and sustainable? And that remains, I think, an issue of politics as well as policy. I think there's no alternative for government taking a leadership role at the legislative level and at the administrative level to try to sketch out plans using, in my opinion, the need to solve the greenhouse gas problem as kind of the overarching metric, but then looking at all the other statutes and regulations that stand in the way of progress. And so I'm an advocate for this organization, REMO and others, reaching out to a variety of stakeholders and trying to put together some actual proposals to change some of the laws that are now on the books.
Great. Chris, same question to you. What do you see as these limiting factors to innovation, and what are some of the levers that Goodyear is pulling to help to enable these?
Yeah, so my perspective will be completely different. It will be from the tech side. I think if you first have to look at is the expectations we all had. And we may have discounted too much. This is a hardware and a software problem. And a lot of folks who were really leading the charge at first and setting those expectations were software folks. And software is developed in a very different way than hardware. And in particular, I would just ask you to think about your phone. Your phone and app glitches, and what do? You turn it off, you turn it on, and you're okay. And that's because the rhythm of software is a process, lean, agile, where you put things out, you make them a little better, and then you just keep improving it. Hardware is different, and especially safety-based hardware, if we think of autonomous driving and things like that. And so I think number one is the expectations that had been set, but number two is then at the intersection of that, and I really liked yesterday the session where the governor of South Carolina and Redwood were talking about where are we going to get the talent. And so I think an accelerant is talent. Now, are we going to really make a lot more talent? Hopefully. But I think it's changing our paradigm around, do we organically have to own all the talent? And our experience has been we can't. And we have great hardware folks, chemists, et cetera. We'll put them up against anybody. But we're not going to out-software people. And so what we've had to do is go find a way to attract that talent. And believe it or not, they don't all want to come to Akron, Ohio. So we went to where they were. We started with 2 folks in 2017 in the Bay Area. And I could say today we've got an innovation center specifically for digital software development, that software side of mobility, of 50 folks. And it's purposely on the West Coast because that's where the universities are, that's where their collaborators are, that's where the other companies are who are trying to make these things happen. So I think I would just say get talent, and the best way to get talent is leverage other people's if you want to do it quicker.
Great. So a follow-up question for you. I know looking through the sorts of investments and innovations that Goodyear's been working on, there's a lot of really exciting potential there. We have also seen, though, the regular dynamic that only relying on a cost basis as a mechanism to bring that sort of exciting new innovation to market and to scale those next frontier products leads to them being left on the shelf. In the case of this innovation that Goodyear's pioneered, things like sustainable material, can you outline what sort of action, either regulatory or otherwise, would be necessary to move those from really exciting pilot programs to scale so that they can start having impact on the big challenges we're trying to solve?
Well, I think first, let me set the context on the scale. Okay, so we make 170 million tires a year. We consume, to do that, 7 billion pounds of material, and we're about 10% of the global market. So that just lets you know how many materials we're talking about when we talk about tires. And we've been doing this, thankfully, for 125 years. We just celebrated last August. And those materials aren't just available at scale and at cost, but they've been purposely designed for performance, okay? And so let me just dive into one example of a material where we've really had to address this, and that's carbon black. And carbon black is a reinforcement for rubber. If we didn't put carbon black in your tires, think of your erasers on your pencils. That's how fast rubber would in fact be abraded off. And so you have to reinforce this. And we really confronted this, as many in the industry, we all had to, was much of that material came from Russia. And so when, of course, the Ukraine conflict, et cetera, happened, we had to go find alternative sources. And I saw a real parallel in SAFE's approach when they think about energy. It wasn't just about finding somebody who can make the same thing, but look for people who are trying to do something different. And there we ran across a company called Monolith. And Monolith was a startup who's basically taking the idea of use methane, which at its chemistry, this will be the extent of the technology, I promise, is 1 carbon atom and 4 hydrogen. And they have a process wherein, without having oxygen present, you're able to separate that. So now you could use that carbon directly into the carbon black. And then, of course, you have the free hydrogen for energy. So really exciting technology. They've got their pilot plant in Nebraska. And what I would point to is what really accelerated this is really a push-pull model, is what I would call it. And the push came, they've got $1 billion worth of loans, assuming they can hit all their milestones from the Department of Energy. And then on the pull side was somebody like us committing to, we're going to use that material. And in fact, we even had our first tires sold in market in 2023 using that material. And they're in the process of scaling up more and more. So I think this push-pull, the public-private, and how we can really work together in order to pull some of these things and to really get them to scale. But the scales are big, right, when we want to replace these sustainable materials.
And particularly when the scales are that big, the impact becomes big as well. Can you maybe give us a little sense of what sort of impacts can come from that shift to a new innovative technology, be it safety or efficiency or emissions? I mean, I know, being where literally the rubber hits the road for so many vehicles really gives you an outsized ability to have that big impact, and that narrative helps to drive a lot of the kind of excitement around future mobility that we see.
Yeah, the things that we're trying to drive overall is efficiency. We do that a lot through our fleet solutions, and on the other side is safety, right? And obviously none of us should be happy with the state of transportation. I thought it's well done in the report, calling out, till everybody, there's no accidents, right? Everybody comes home the same way they left in the vehicle. But when we think about the materials, this is all about emissions and how we're going to go achieve our GHG commitments and the things we've laid out. Now, we've made other ones around sustainable materials, soybean oil instead of petrochemical oil, but we've got many of these proof points that have to happen. You can't just go put a 2050 target out there. Mm-hmm. We have all these interim goals. This is one of those that helps us towards that GHG objectives that we have.
That's great. Question for Mary.
Yeah.
So you've been very successful in your career at leveraging regulatory efforts to drive change in transportation. Can you share with us some lessons from your work that could be applied today to help us break some of the gridlock we're seeing, where regulation can help us unlock this potential of future mobility we keep talking about?
Well, the example that we were just that Chris was just discussing here points up the fact that you could have great innovation happening in the tire space. You can get the vehicle manufacturers to adopt those technologies, but somebody's also got to be dealing with what the effects are on the roadways, and that involves government agencies and also involves an existing system which is quite hidebound in its own way in terms of the way that investments are made, where the priorities are. And then when you start to ask, how are we going to deal with the impact of the increased weight of the vehicles that are out there now, suddenly we're in a system where everything is not quite, all the pieces are not quite there that need to be in place. And so I guess I feel that what we've been able to show when we first started working on air quality and later climate change is that you have to set goals, but they need to be done in recognition of the full system that you're trying to deal with. So, for example, in the initial work that we did on climate back in 2007 through 2010, the Air Resources Board was given the task of writing the plan, but we had to take into account all the submissions that came from other agencies that had a piece of the puzzle, primarily the energy agencies that were dealing with where the electricity was going to come from that was going to fuel the electric vehicles that we were trying to bring on, where the transportation sector was going to be able to provide for fueling, the cities, the counties, the ports. It says you can't solve for one piece of the puzzle without bringing the other pieces into the equation. And I think, to the extent that we have been successful with some of these efforts, particularly in terms of cleaning up smog, it was because we had leaders at the political level. We had governors, we had mayors, counties that were willing to go out on the limb and frankly recognize the will of the people, that they wanted healthy air, and so they were willing to put up with some of the temporary obstacles and some of the pushback from different incumbent groups that were upset about one piece or another of this, because the overarching goal was to make the air cleaner, and you could show that there was progress along the way. So this doesn't, it's not a magic wand by any means, but it does just remind us that we have to plan, and we have to set goals that take into account what we learn along the way, and then be prepared to stick to the big goals while being flexible as we learn that sometimes the things we thought were going to be the solution are not the actual solution.
So you mentioned the idea that the challenge of trying to solve a problem through one puzzle piece, and obviously the theme for the summit is solving a global power puzzle. You know, when you think of the coordination that was discussed a lot yesterday in the context of critical minerals and raw materials, and will be a theme, I'm sure, again here today, you know, what are the effective mechanisms for bringing those stakeholders to the table in a meaningful way, and then orchestrating the sort of collaboration that has to take place between, you know, just in the public sector at a federal, state, county, MPO, local level, and then you bring in the private sector as well, and that coordination challenge becomes quite daunting. So what are some of the advice that you would offer to folks in this room for how to do that effectively?
Well, first of all, I think that there's no substitute for talking to people from the different parts of this mechanism, and bringing them together is a start, physically getting together, but adopting some kind of rules of the road is also important. And I think back to the first meeting of the REMO commissioners, when we were literally just meeting each other in many cases, and we had people from different countries and from different sectors, including academia and auto manufacturing and operations of transit and others. And the first person who said, you know, the thing that we really need to change about the way we look at transportation is looking at it from a human perspective. That is, it's not about the system, it's not about the roads, it's not even about the movement of goods. It's about people and what we can do with and for them to make mobility a reality, and not just assume that everybody wants the same thing or that they want to do things the way they always did them. So it's about sort of going back to the consumer, if you will, to the person who gets to vote either with their pocketbook or their ballot, and finding out, you know, what are the things that they think are the most important in the transportation system. We had a ballot initiative on the ballot for the primary election in Los Angeles that just took place, and there was a measure that was put on the ballot which kind of slipped on, although it had been put together by a coalition of groups over a period of a very long time, that committed all the stakeholders to live by a plan that had actually been adopted many years ago for facilitating bicycle lanes and improving traffic flows and making the pedestrian crossing safer. And suddenly, when it appeared on the ballot, you had various entities, you know, stepping out and saying, well, wait a minute, this means we're going to have to spend money. We're going to have to actually do these things. And, you know, that's going to be hard. And maybe it'll get in the way of other things that we want to do. And it was passed overwhelmingly because people have been waiting a long time for some of these. You know, we've been talking for years about how our city could be made more bicycle friendly, more pedestrian friendly. And everybody sort of thinks, yeah, that's a good thing. But it doesn't happen without actually going out and spending money and providing for the safe facilities. So that's obviously a local example, but I think it's typical of many of the issues that we're dealing with here, are that we can all articulate what we think the goal is, but then we have to actually get down to doing it.
And I think one potential enabling factor that we've seen discussed a lot in the innovation space is data and the potential to harness data. I mean, this moniker that data is the new oil has been tossed around for the past at least decade. Mm-hmm. The tagline was catchy. There's certainly a lot of data out there. What has been more challenging is how do you harness that data in a way that actually allows us to measure the things we care about and transform that data into new products and services that meet needs and have impact. I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit on just how we can put data to work, either in the regulatory space on the public sector side, or on the private sector side. How do we leverage that data to deliver new products and services to customers?
Well, it is. It's an interactive issue because we tend to assume that the more data we have, the better, and somehow once we get it, we'll know what to do with it. And it doesn't always work that way. I go back a long way in environmental regulation. I remember when I first got involved in dealing with some of the issues about water quality in Los Angeles, and the federal law that was already on the books required any company that emitted more than a trivial amount of water into, is dumping any amount of water from their operations into a stream or into the ocean, had to provide continuous monitoring of the pollution that was in that stream. Continuous monitoring for a 24-hour operation meant reams and reams of information about pollutants. But when it got to the agency, there was nobody there to read it, much less ask the question of how do we filter it to find out what the most important things are that we're actually looking for, and then how are we going to take that information. Maybe it's just an enforcement action because there's already a regulation on the books, but maybe when you look at it, you find out that the regulation isn't designed very well to achieve enforcement. We still have a lot of that in our thinking, and but if we start off asking the question, how do we get to a safer water supply, and then ask the question, okay, what kinds of data would we really need to know, and how do we get them? How do we get those data and get them in a format that we can use? We now have so much better tools than we used to in terms of collection and analysis. But it does take some time, and it takes some thinking, which is sometimes the hardest part, about what it is you actually want to use that data for. And I think that's an example that just holds true in a lot of areas now. We just passed two bills, but one I think has gotten a lot of attention in the California state legislature. The governor signed that for the first time is going to require reporting of greenhouse gas emissions by any company that does business in California over a very small size. And it requires Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 for all of the aficionados of greenhouse gas reporting, which goes, again, well beyond what the new SEC regulations are going to require, because they did not include Scope 3, and they left out a fair number of types of businesses. Well, that's great. We've got this really strong law, and now how are we going to implement it? And that was left to the Air Resources Board, once again, or somebody, but it looks like it's ARB, to actually define what that's going to be and how it's going to work. And, of course, we're in a budget crisis at the moment, so we need money to actually get people in there, and we need a process which, the state is experienced and good at dealing with various kinds of industries and taking input and, consolidating it and working with our experts in academia. But this is a big one. This is going to be beyond, I think, anything that's been attempted in terms of the amount of interaction that is going to be required with the financial community, which are probably the most immediately impacted by all of this. So I'm excited about the opportunity, but I also realize that we, the state, is going to be very much out there on the line as the ones who are going to have to think through how this is actually going to work. Otherwise, we'll be stuck with those boxes full of data that nobody knows what to do with.
So, Chris, as a CTO, how do you? You must think about data in a very different way. How do you think about data in your job, and then also in how Goodyear might put that data to use?
Yeah, I'll probably take it in terms of the data around the vehicle. We've introduced some intelligence around the tire, so the tire isn't simply we'll call it dumb product that's passive. It's an active component in the system. And because we're the only thing that touches the road, we actually have a lot of insights that are pretty important to driving. And especially when you take people out, we think we're bad drivers, but there are a lot of important jobs we do. We can really sense over years of doing this what's happening through the wheel or through our bodies in the seat, feet on pedals. Am I under control or aren't I? And so we're doing things like being able to monitor at that interface, what's the friction, which tells you how fast you can take a corner. And I know coming up this morning we're going to have Gaddick. Gaddick is somebody we invested in through our corporate venture fund. But when we do that, we're a strategic, meaning we do work together. And so what we're doing with them is giving them a prediction of what should they be able to count on in terms of that friction at the road, which tells them in their instructions for their AV system how fast can they take a corner, etc. We're giving them real-time conditions of the tire, and they can use that in terms of understanding the stiffnesses and things about the tire, which are really important for vehicle dynamics. And, otherwise you're going to have this AV going like this in the lane, and everybody's going to think it's an impaired driver. So, there's things that we can really do, but if we have to go put our own system on to recreate some of that information, that's going to drive more cost on these systems, which makes these systems less accessible. If we could use the data somebody else has, but at the same time offering up the data we have, we can collectively, I think, bring these solutions faster. So I think there's something to be said here that our parents probably taught us when we were little kids is share, right? And if we're advocating for closed systems, we're probably not doing justice to being able to bring this as fast as possible.
So we could go on for a long time on these topics, and we've only really just scratched the surface. But cognizant of time, want to wrap with one very short, one-sentence question and answer. So we spend a lot of time reimagining the future of mobility here, as you might imagine. I'd like to hear from each of you, what's the transportation technology or innovation that you're most excited to see the impact of over the next decade? Chris, you want to start?
I could go for sure.
Yeah, sure.
We mentioned data and things, but I'm going to really put out more like when you think of all these technologies, since you come together in a forum like this, it really puts this guiding, almost North Star problems in front of us. And when you do that and you bring smart people together, and those smart people, yesterday was mentioned twice, like our national labs, and I really wanted to plug them. That has been just a fantastic thing for us. So if you don't have a CRADA with your national lab and you want to talk to somebody who has one, it's fantastic. But when we have that compelling vision, a commitment to collaborate and how we're going to really solve these problems. If we're going to really make progress, and I think over the next 10 years, there's a realization of that. There's a compelling urgency. I think yesterday laid out a lot of the urgency around solving these problems. And so when there's will, smart people, point them in the right direction, I think it's just this collaboration around it that excites me the most.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would probably push in the direction of more thought going into how we integrate the need that we already see for more electricity, more renewable electricity, and reinventing or rebuilding our cities to be looking at how we can make the local grids more efficient, more effective, and improve the overall quality of people's lives and experience by doing that. So it's really integrating more of the housing, urban planning, and transportation systems together to get the best out of everything for the quality of people's lives.
That's great. Thanks. We've got our grid security project coming up soon, so stay tuned. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to our audience. Appreciate it. Thank you.